Augustine, often called the oldest city, is located in northeast Florida. As a historic coastal town, there are a lot of things that make it a unique place to live. With a rich and dynamic past and so many irreplaceable historic buildings, there's a lot to save and a lot to lose in the oldest city.
St. Augustine is the Spanish colonial city in the United States. It predates Jamestown and Plymouth. So it was founded in 1565. We have archaeological evidence dating back 14,000 years, which makes it some of the earliest habitation anywhere on the planet. I came to St. Augustine the first time a very long time ago. As a kid in 1981, and I saw the Spanish colonial buildings downtown and the Hotel Ponce de Leon, and I was just very struck by this amazing chapter in the United States history that I had never heard anything about, and I was a history major in college.
I mean, I grew up here. I've lived here all my life, and it's a really interesting place because it's like this really cool coastal area that's got a lot of European influence. I'd say it's like the closest thing you can get to like going to Europe while staying in the States.
I think anytime you can take a physical resource, whether it's an archaeological site or it's an above ground resource, and you can demonstrate history to people by being able to provide something they can look at, sometimes touch, experience, it makes it personal. It comes off a page of paper or away from a speech, and it becomes something very real.
I think what has our major draw for tourism is just the amount of history that's here and the fact that it's such an awesome place to experience it.
Flagler College is one of the most beautiful campuses in the world and one of the city's most desirable to live in.
I always ask students what drew you here, and invariably the conversation always revolves around just having the opportunity to live in and dine in what is really a living museum. And you don't have that opportunity anywhere in the world.
I've kind of watched the city deal with a lot of different things, a lot of like big population change, obviously very awful weather.
North Florida have never been hit by a hurricane this strong.
St. Augustine was put in an unfortunate spotlight in 2017 after it was affected by a hurricane for the second time in a year. Local businesses had just gotten back on their feet after Hurricane Matthew when Irma reared her ugly head and reversed their progress. Locals were forced out of their homes in low-lying areas. Jack Cheney and his family experienced this firsthand.
I have probably the lowest lying room in our house. I had about 19 inches up the wall of water. And it was a really similar story for all of my neighbors. My parents are still paying off our house, so we had flood insurance, covered all the structural elements of the house. And we were out for about 9 months.
It's hard to tease out what part of a flood event was due to sort of wind and tide versus how much of it was due to sea level rise. The sort of really severe inundation we got with those two storms, it's more sort of storm surge driven, which is related to the hurricanes and not necessarily sea level rise. But we know for a fact, you look at tide gauges all around the country, you look at tide gauges all around the world, the ocean's going up. We know that for sure. Sea level rise is sort of inherent in the name. It's the gradual rise in sea surface height. It's due to a number of things. Thermal expansion is part of it, and then the contributions from land-based glaciers melting and ice loss.
This
spoken to the mayor. She's taken this issue very seriously. It takes time, unfortunately, to put into place a lot of mechanisms for adaptation and mitigation to sea level rise.
I don't think there's anything more important for our city to approach and manage than sea level rise. There's just not. If you don't have the wonderful buildings and the wonderful experiences that people come here for, you have no business. You have no town left.
I also have been working to save buildings essentially my entire adult life, and to think that I have worked in communities to try to help them conserve their resources, save them, preserve them, educate with them, understand, use them to appreciate for tourists, for residents, and then to think that sea level rise would turn around and take them is personally painful.
What we have to do is understand that the insurance companies have known this for years. They're looking at the same sea level rise data we are. And so we need to make sure we as a city are doing the right things to make sure we don't increase that vulnerability for the people who live here and have invested in their homes and their lives and their businesses here.
I think St. Augustine needs to think about sea level rise as the precursor to our infrastructure. The city could stand to lose a lot of revenue if those landmarks are really heavily affected. If they're inaccessible, that's going to be a really hard sell.
I just received maps that show what our neighborhoods will look like with 1.5 feet of sea level rise, which is probably a conservative number by 2030. The moat will fill in by 2030 around the Castillo. You can go to the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer and you pick 1.5 feet, which is about what we'll see, 1.5 feet to 2 by 2030, and the moat fills in.
You're not talking about feet of sea level rise a year. You're talking about something that's like, it's hard to observe with the naked eye. Along the southeast US coast, I think over the last 10 years, like 8 or 10 years, the rates of sea level increase were 6 times that, which is significant.
If we start dealing with sea level rise, you've got a lot of people that are going to be displaced. They have to have somewhere to go, and they have to have a city that can still work for them.
What we're going to start to see more of, I think, is, these days where we have like 3 days of a northeast wind, or we have some 5-day nor'easter in the winter. The coastal flooding, where it might have been bad, it's just going to start to get a lot worse.
Dr. Keyes and I have had several long conversations about how does the college plan for the future. And we've even talked to the president of the college about that and looking at what we do to protect the resources that are so singular at the college in the face of rainy day, sunny day flooding and hurricanes, just as we see planning for the city to protect their amazing historical and archaeological resources.
There would be some question as to whether or not Flagler College would in fact exist if it were not for these buildings that we have and the care that we have. But it would certainly be a very different place.
Particularly along the US southeast coastline, of which obviously like St. Augustine and Northeast Florida is a part of, the sea level rise has been much higher than it has globally. So there's sort of a global average, how much sea level is going up. In the southeast United States coastline, they call it a sea level rise hotspot, and we have significantly sort of increased rates of sea level rise over the last 10 years, 15 years compared to a lot of other places.
So those are the decisions that we're going to be making as a community. How do we best manage around this? What are the things that we save and what are the things that we are not able to save?
The next step for St. Augustine is to start a city-wide conversation about how we can best prepare for sea level rise and save the history that makes it the oldest city. Keeping History Above Water is a conference intended to create a dialogue about how to preserve historic coastal cities in the face of rising seas.
It's an international conference that was started in Newport, Rhode Island, so way up in New England on the coast a couple of years ago. The first one was hosted in 2016, and there were 300 people from all over the world that came to that conference. It was truly amazing. They asked us to compete to host that conference here, and we competed against a couple of other cities. And St. Augustine absolutely stepped up very quickly. We have been selected, so we're getting ready to make the formal public announcement and move forward with that. So we will host that in the spring of 2019. So I see this as sort of my last challenge in my career, is to give it, that last hurrah and see what else we can do to try to make sure that those resources are here for the next generation. And I have kids and grandkids now, so I want them to be able to appreciate them too.
It has to be in the back of our minds and probably should be in the front of our minds, because these are really special places.
St. Augustine is more than a vacation destination. It's more than the oldest city in the U.S. It's more than the college campus that occupies the center of downtown. It's all of that. And it's a home. It's the farmers markets. It's the musicians off of St. George Street. It's all the restaurants. It's a distillery. It's the horse carriages. It's the bayfront. It's the beaches. It's some of the best places and people that I've ever met. There are enough of us that care about this city to save it.